The Pentagon Papers, a slideshow by Morgan Bacharach, Taylor Smith, and Michaela Farr. Next slide. Facts on the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were classified information from the Department of Defense about the American political and military involvement in the Vietnam War. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who worked on the study for several years, who grew opposed to the war, later decided that the information discussed in these reports should be made available to the American public. In 1971, Ellsberg secretly photocopied these Pentagon Papers and gave them to the New York Times. The New York Times later published a piece on the report in a series of 3 excerpts. Next slide. The Time publishes the Pentagon Papers. June 13, 1971, the New York Times published the information contained in the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times decided to distribute this information in a series of 3 articles with excerpts from the document. The U.S. government became angered by the publication of these papers. They feared it would compromise the security of the nation. Therefore, after the 3rd article was published, the United States Department of Justice placed a temporary restraining order restricting the further publications on the Pentagon Papers. Next slide. Lower court verdict. The District Court, as well as the Court of Appeals, stated that the United States government did not meet the requirements justifying their censorship, which means the Court of Appeals and the District Court did not feel that the government's appeal on national security met the proper requirements, and the prior restraint placed on the New York Times was still held. Next slide. Lower court verdict timeline. June 21st, 1971. All it says is that in Washington, the federal judge, Jessel, denies the government's request for an investigation against the Washington Post. After this, the government immediately appeals to the District Court Circuit. June 23, 1971, the District Court Circuit Court of Appeals, on a vote of 7-2, Judge Jessel's decision denying the government an investigation on the Washington Post. In New York, after a hearing, the Second Circuit remands the case involving the New York Times to another judge, Griffin, for further camera proceedings. June 26. The day after granting the government and the New York Times appeals petitions, the Supreme Court hears oral arguments in New York Times versus the United States. June 28. Ellsberg then surrenders to the rest of the federal courthouse in Boston. A grand jury in Los Angeles indicts Daniel Ellsberg for theft and espionage against the U.S. government. This is because he photocopied the Pentagon Papers illegally. Next slide. Petition before the Supreme Court. In the case, the New York Times versus the United States being the petitioner, the chief lawyers for the United States were Alexander M. Bickel and William E. Hegarty. The claim presented by the petitioners before the Supreme Court was that the government efforts to prevent the New York Times from publishing certain Vietnam War documents known as the Pentagon Papers were justified because of the interests of national security. So in other words, the U.S. government said that these papers should not be published because it inflicted the national security. Next slide. New York Times versus the United States goes to the Supreme Court. June 26th, the New York Times, alongside the Washington Post, they came together as one, brought their court case to the Supreme Court to defend their First Amendment rights and protest the government's censorship on the publication of the Pentagon Papers. The prosecuting side argued that the press does not have the right to publish classified government documents. Several cases were referenced on the defendant's side, including the Espionage Act of 1917 and the court case of Neer versus Minnesota. Next slide. Supreme Court judges. In the picture below are the judges that presided over the court case, being Black, Douglas, Brennan, Stewart, Marshall, Berger, Harlan, and Black. Next slide. Supreme Court verdict. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court verdict remained the same to the lower courts, defending in the favor of the First Amendment. The court concluded the prior restraint was unconstitutional. The New York Times then resumed the series of publications on the Pentagon Papers. Next slide. Judges' concurrence. Black, Douglas, Brennan, Stewart, White, and Marshall agreed with the New York Times in that the peoples have the right to know what happened. They strongly emphasized how the Founding Fathers specifically created the Bill of Rights to protect citizens from the government, especially the freedom of speech. Justice Black stated, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." Next slide. Judges' dissent. Berger, Harlan, and Blackman agreed with the government in that the publishing of the documents would lead to a threat in national security.